if we can take on carbohydrates during our runs, particularly during like our events, then we can prevent that depletion of our glycogen stores because we keep on top of it. And so we can maintain our pace for much longer. So that's kind of where the theory originally came from.
Thank you very much, Renee, for coming on the Run As Well podcast. Always great to chat to you. We appreciate you making the time for us.
Thank you for having me again.
So we want to talk about consuming carbs during the race. And I think there's been quite a lot of headlines about this. And maybe one figure that's getting thrown around is 90 grams of carbohydrates. But can you kind of set the scene for us? Like how did this idea kind of first come into people's heads that they should be taking on a few more carbs than maybe they already are?
Yeah, so I think, it's important to give you a little bit of a background. I guess it's first important to remember that as humans, we don't have an infinite store of carbohydrate in our body. Like, we consume carbohydrate and it's stored in our muscles mainly as glycogen. And so if we have full glycogens, and I'll come back to that because that in itself takes a bit of effort, but if we have full glycogens, we've got probably enough energy to keep us going for about 90 to 120 minutes, depending on your pace. So they use moderate intensity pace, but that, you can translate that as you want. So what we do know is the quicker you go, the faster that you deplete this store. So if we're thinking about distances, probably like half marathon and above, you're going to run out of fuel relatively quickly, and that's going to then have an impact on your performance. So particularly if you're trying to hit a race pace, and I guess again that's kind of there's theory behind what your race pace will be, but if we're looking at something like a half marathon, you might be running at like 80% of your VO2 max for a significant period of time, but you're going to use that carbohydrate probably within that 90 minutes, if I'm honest, at that sort of pace, maybe even a little bit quicker. And so if you go out too hard, like sometimes we do in races, you'll use that faster. And so what happens is if we then run out of glycogen stores, our body needs to find another source of energy to keep us going. And while it can switch to fat oxidation, like it's kind of always doing a bit of fat oxidation in the background, but when there's no carbohydrate available at all left, then fundamentally we need to just rely on fat oxidation. And when it does, it's a much less efficient process. And so we just can't stick to that like 80% of your VO2 max pace. And I guess that's the issue, is that if you're someone who's got a goal and you've got a particular time you're trying to hit from a target point of view, this is quite important to get it right. So that's where the introduction of, if we can take on kind of carbohydrates during our runs, particularly during like our events, then we can prevent that depletion of our glycogen stores because we keep on top of it. And so we can maintain our pace for much longer. So that's kind of where the theory originally came from. And the numbers bandied around have changed over the years, to be honest.
What's interesting about all of that, pace is obviously quite a key determinant of volume that you can then or should try and ingest. So when we get these numbers come through, mainly from elites, or certainly research around elite athletes and 90 grams or more, is that because they're simply running at such a pace comparable to maybe your average, in inverted, quotation, average runner? Is that pace the key determinant? So when you see these high numbers, it's because they're burning fuel at they're burning glycogen that needs to be replenished at a much higher rate than most runners?
I guess it's kind of relative, right? Because we all have our top pace. So, I have to admit, I haven't done a VO2 max test for a very long time, but in the past, when I have done like my sort of like flat out 100% pace was probably in the region of, I don't know, like 6-minute miling, but I can't maintain that for an hour, right? But what I could maintain this is way back in the day, was like probably a 6:52 pace for an hour. And so that would kind of be like my half marathon-ish pace. which meant that basically I could hold that pace without building too many hydrogen ions and getting too fatigued. So, it's kind of, you're always balancing that. So an elite level athlete will be much quicker than that. But it's all relative, right? In the sense that for me, that is still a very fast pace that's going to use carbohydrate at a high rate. So I'd probably say running at that pace, I was probably depleting my stores within 75 minutes. So I definitely had to keep on top of my intakes.
Right.
Whereas if you're looking at, you look at some of the results that came out of London Marathon, 202, 203, I mean, they'll be burning that carbohydrate in a similar at a similar level, but so they might not need as much carbohydrate as regularly throughout, because they'll only be running for 2 hours. They'll definitely need to be taking something in, but the idea might be that they take something in at 30 minutes, then again at 30 minutes, and then again at another 30 minutes, so that they maybe have 3 hits, which maintains that ability to keep that pace going up. Whereas somebody who's out running for 3 hours will still be running at the intensity that's relative to them, but they will need to get that regularity for a lot longer, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so that timing would extrapolate onwards. If someone's intensity was for them very high, but they were still running 5 hours, they're still the volume that they're going to have to consume is the same because of the intensity.
Yeah, that's right.
All right, great.
Am I right really in thinking that 60 grams was looked at as a bit of a gold standard for a long time, and now there's been stuff that's come out that says actually we should be looking at 90? That feels, just on a personal, that feels like quite a lot to me, because I think if you're thinking about what that actually means in terms of gels, please correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm thinking that's maybe 4 gels an hour territory. And if you were, say, running a marathon and you were going to run 4 hours, just in terms of what you'd actually have to carry, because unlike elites, we don't have someone who's going to pass us a kind of Morton bottle or something. So does there come a point where actually just the practicalities of having 90 grams actually almost outweigh the theoretical benefits of doing that?
Yeah, 100%. And I think it is a really important consideration. And I guess, the 60 grams was kind of up until about 2003. That was the gold standard. We should all be like, especially if you're doing 3 hours or more, 60 grams is what you should be aiming for per hour. And what they found was that actually they kind of realized that if we could consume more, then we could basically maintain that pace for even longer, right? So again, looking at the elite level, I guess, more than the general kind of public. And what they noticed was that the kind of the limiting factor was absorption. So we can absorb 60 grams of glucose per hour. So that's like a particular type of carbohydrate. But we still had these fructose receptors, another type of carbohydrate, that we could absorb 30 grams of carbs from. Okay. So this is where they then started to talk about these kind of like what they call multiple transport aids, where you consume a combination of both glucose and fructose, and you can get that 90 grams of carbs per hour, which meant you could potentially prolong your pace for a little bit longer because we can absorb that. That still stands, and I think it's really important that we highlight that physiologically we are all the same to a certain degree. Obviously, athletically we're not. So physiologically we all still have those glucose receptors and those fructose receptors. So to a certain degree we're kind of limited to that 90 grams of carbs per hour. It's a really good question to ask. Do we all need to be consuming 90 grams of carbs per hour? And I think the bit that's difficult is that while when we're running, it might feel like we're running at a higher intensity. So somebody who's running 5 hours versus 3 hours versus 2 hours, actually, is it the same kind of effort in terms of exertion? So are they actually utilizing that much carbohydrate per hour in terms of, although it feels like an effort, like actually is it physiologically that effort? So I think that's something that, without everybody going off and getting tested in labs and finding out, it's a difficult one to go on. When it comes to how much to consume and when, I generally will work with where somebody's at to start with. So what we do know is that there doesn't seem to be much benefit in taking less than 40 grams of carbs per hour for anyone. So that's a good starting point. Like, if you've got somebody who's never taken carbs before, then aim for 40 grams of carbs per hour, and then you need to build it up fundamentally. There are now lots of new products on the market that actually give you more carbohydrate per gel. So, for example, Morton and SIS Beta Fuel, these are all kind of much higher in carbohydrate. So it means that you can carry less, but you're going to get more delivery. So that is something you can do. I guess the other thing about big races, so like London Marathon, for example, that they're sponsored by a certain product. So again, that product's going to be available en route. So something I always recommend that people think about is potentially using the sponsored product in their training, so that can also be something they pick up as they go around. They don't have to carry quite as much. But obviously, not everybody's going to want to do that. So yeah, it's an interesting one. I think from experience, both professionally and personally, if you can consume more carbs per hour, you will run at a pace for a lot longer. Like that is a given. Definitely see it with athletes I work with, that if for whatever reason they get some GI distress or something doesn't go right on race day, and they can't consume their usual maximum amount per hour, then they often don't have a great race because the body is going to be limited to a certain degree. So, but the 90 grams, I'll be honest, it's not something I say needs to be done definitively. I'll say, aim for somewhere between 60 and 90 grams of carbs per hour. So for some people that might be 65, for some people that might be 70, for some people it might be 90, and it very much will vary. And you might find that actually it fluctuates a little bit per hour as well, so it's one of those, it's an average figure. And I think it's important when people start getting really worried about the fact that I didn't hit it or I dropped a gel, and that's not going to make that much difference in the grand scheme of things. So I think it's what we say it's worth aiming for, but you don't need to be kind of religious about it. If it does mean you have to carry 20 gels, which is ridiculous, and I don't think you can actually consume that many without being sick. So we have to be sensible.
From that practicality perspective, is it from that 90 grams from the get-go? Or is it, as you say, your body has, if you fueled correctly, you've got good, let's say, an hour in you of effort? So, could you not have anything for the first hour of a race and then start? Or is it, do you tip over a point of depletion where you're kind of always on the back foot?
Yeah, it's definitely better to start earlier than it is to start later. Remember also when you're especially in a race situation, there'll be adrenaline kind of kicking in. So you might have used a little bit more energy before you even start. So I tend to tell people to start ideally within 30 minutes, but 45 would be my kind of the latest possible time I'd say start taking fuel on within a longer kind of capacity.
Some of these studies that come out, I think, are on Cyclist, and some of the higher numbers seem to be on Cyclist. And I don't cycle as regularly. Ben's obviously keen cyclist, but I feel like it's easier to take on carbs in the saddle, isn't it? You just sat down, whereas
it's easy. You can eat what you want.
So, do we need to make a distinction there between what is sensible for cyclists or possible for cyclists and what's possible for runners?
Yeah. So the latest studies are actually talking about 120 grams of carbs for cyclists. Well, for ultra endurance, they're talking about. It's been really fascinating because I've obviously had a few of the elite professional athletes that I work with going, well, if 120 is the goal, then that's what we should do, because obviously that's how we're going to get best results. And it kind of makes sense. There's only one study that's been done on runners,
Okay.
and it was done on a mountain marathon, so slightly different kind of terrain for a start. Also done only on 20 men,
Right.
and they were all trained.
Okay.
So I think we have to be really careful about extrapolating data from sometimes from the studies into, and now everyone needs to have 120 grams per hour. It's not, I don't think there's enough robust literature yet to say that we need to be doing that. And in the handful of athletes that I have used it with, and these are top end individuals, it hasn't gone down well.
Right.
As in, it's just been very difficult to maintain and manage. You also have to change the ratio of glucose to fructose. So normally when we're looking at our 90 grams, it would be a 2-to-1 ratio. So, 60 to 30, as we discussed earlier. When you're looking at 120 grams of carbohydrate, because we know that we can only absorb 60 grams of glucose, you can't suddenly increase that. You have to kind of change the ratio. So it appears to be that the ratio they're using now is either 1-to-1 or 1-to-0.8, which is complicated in itself. Like, no one is making that product right now. So, how do you do that? And that's what we found practically, trying to get the ratio right, particularly on and I was using it for an athlete on a 100-mile race, basically, was really, really complicated. And in the end, we just gave up, and we were like, do you know what? This is too much of a headache. And it didn't sit that well in his stomach. And again, when we looked at the other study, the only other study that's been done, it has been done on cyclists, which again is much, much easier to absorb when you're on a bike than when you're running, because the mechanical action of running in itself causes distress in the stomach. What is interesting is when you go back to the original studies around how much can we actually absorb per hour, it appears that 100 grams per hour seems to be the optimal in terms of not leaving too much residue in your stomach and you actually absorbing. Because that's the thing, what you don't want to do is have any residue going into your digestive tract, because that's potentially going to cause you more intestinal problems, like more kind of GI distress. So the science still states that we should be aiming for that. But I think sometimes when we're in practice, we have to look at, is it practical? Can I really carry 20 gels with me? And the answer is probably no. And 2, am I going to want to consume 20 gels? And the answer is probably no. And 3, is it relevant to me when I'm not a pro athlete? I'm not so I think it's very different to say 90 grams, 100 grams of carbs if you're going to be doing a 2-hour marathon compared to someone who's going to do a 5-hour marathon. I think you have to start being a little bit more kind of savvy and work out what's more appropriate for you from that point of view.
You mentioned there absorption and also like GI issues, and I was wondering if there was if you took GI out of the equation, as in everyone's, because gut training I think is another thing that people always talk about. Training the gut, absorption, GI issues, are they separate issues or are they sort of one of the same? As in, are you limited? Is your absorption limited by your stomach, or is your body just physically only able to absorb a certain amount? Or can you train your gut to be infinitely brilliant at like absorbing carbohydrate, and there's no ceiling?
Yeah, I mean, so it's a really good question. I mean, absorption is the limiting factor for us as humans. And again, depending on the deliverable, so depending on kind of the combination of glucose, fructose, sometimes you have maltodextrin, all these different kind of sugars, there will be some potential residue that you don't absorb fully. So if we get too much of that, and then you combine that obviously with like dehydration and everything else, like there's a number of different factors, and then the mechanical action of running, that's the reason why you're going to end up more likely to end up with GI issues. But absolutely, you're right, Ben. Everybody probably needs to learn to train the gut. Like if you've never taken any fuel, like let's say you've always just done, I don't know, up to an hour of running every, 3-4 times a week, and that's what you do. You're not going to take fuel on for an hour's run. But you suddenly decide to sign up for your first marathon. Of course, you're going to have to take fuel on. And so in those cases, I would always say start small and build up. So, start with that 40 grams of carbs, get really confident that your stomach can cope with that, and then add a bit more, and find out where your optimal is. I think the other thing that we probably need to talk about is that there's been no studies done on women whatsoever on this. Wow. So from a female athlete point of view, we don't know if even 90 grams is too much, right?
No studies.
So
that's bad.
It's awful, isn't it?
Yeah. So we can so it's interesting. I saw a post the other day on Instagram directed at women saying you should be starting to think about getting that 90 to 120 grams of carbs per hour. And I know why they did it. They're doing it to kind of encourage women to not be fearful of carbohydrate, which I 100% agree with. However, bearing in mind what I've just said about that 120 gram per hour study, one, it was done on men and it was done on trained men, and the other study was done on cyclists, again, male. We don't have that information to kind of extrapolate that data and say, it's going to be fine for women. It might not be. You might get the odd female that absolutely can manage 100 grams of carbs per hour, 120 grams of carbs per hour, absolutely. But we don't know. And I think you have to be quite mindful. In my experience, I have found, and this is just observationally working with, again, the kind of higher end professional female athletes, 70 to 80 seems to be where majority of them find that they're comfortable and can maintain that per hour. Now, I'm not saying that is the exact number it should be, but just from observational
it's interesting,
work.
Yeah. Can we talk about the difference between like drinks and gels? Because I've always thought in an ideal world, I'd just take a drink. That would be perfect. I feel like it'd be easier to absorb, and it's obviously what you kind of tend to see most pro athletes, at least in the marathon or doing, is they get a drink and there's loads of carbs in, say, the Morton drink, for instance. It's not super practical for the amateur, but is there a difference? Do you think theoretically you could take on more if you added a liquid in or just did liquids as opposed to gels?
Yeah, I mean, I'll be honest, I'm a big fan of carbohydrate drinks personally. I think you get a bit more you get the rehydration alongside the delivery of carbohydrate, which I think is quite important. And obviously equally, sometimes you can find carb drinks that also are slightly higher in electrolytes. So again, if you're somebody who has higher sodium losses, for example, it can be very difficult to get that back in. But if you've got a drink that delivers carbs, electrolytes and liquid, I think you're less likely to get those kind of GI issues, particularly around dehydration, because at least you're consuming the liquid alongside it. I think what I found quite interesting is when I did London Marathon years and years and years ago. I think like the last time I did it was 2012, and nobody wore a pack. These race packs that everybody wears now. Nobody wore one, and yet watching marathons now on the telly, when you watch them, it feels like everybody wearing them, and it's I mean, I'm not saying it's not the right answer. I think potentially it is, but I think the difference is that, again, when you're an elite level, you're going for a particular time, so you don't want to be carrying your drinks and your water, and because it's extra weight and potentially that will slow you down. But if you are someone who the goal is to finish a marathon, then actually that is one way, like we do in ultras. You have to carry mandatory kit, you have to carry your water and things. So you just do it. It becomes part of your race kit. So I think it's funny how it's all changing, and I guess people are becoming more conscious that, I do need to take water on. And actually, you could argue that, when you're veering off to get your water from the table, you're wasting a bit of time. And actually, if you've got it on you, you're not going to waste that energy, and you're not going to necessarily waste that time. So pros and cons, I guess, to think about.
Yeah. We spoke to one of the ever presidents ahead of the London Marathon, which was fascinating because he ran it, and he's a very fast man, and he ran the first one on in 2:30 something. Yeah, so like a really fast marathon, but had nothing like water, and I'm completely on board with like the progression that's been made and people understanding more the fueling, and obviously it's hugely beneficial to what the times we've seen change over the years and the elite performance and stuff like that. But people were still very able to run very fast marathons without having anything. And I'm just wondering, are they anomalies, or is that just the learned approach at the time, and it's just changed over years? Because there is always that thing like, well, back in my day, completely, I would have had half a banana was cheating. So it's kind of, I'm sort of intrigued by that. Like,
it's still possible to perform well.
Yeah, it was still possible to perform well, but maybe really bad for you.
Yeah.
Or maybe we're too obsessed with the new wave of stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think, like, I remember doing a workshop maybe 10 years ago, and I was saying, we should be aiming for this many grams of carbs, etc., etc. And this guy piped up. He's like, well, Ron Hill didn't run his marathon on any energy, so why are we doing it? And I was like, it's a valid point. Yeah. Right? It's a valid point. And I think just because science exists, it doesn't always mean it's going to improve things. I think what we do know is that if you consume carbohydrate during something like a marathon or longer, it's not just the fact that it's helping you to maintain your energy levels. It's also that it's preventing some of the damage that can happen, the muscle damage that can happen. So it means that you're potentially recovering a lot quicker. And that was definitely one of the things they were looking at in that study with the mountain marathon, was if you take on carbohydrate at a higher rate, do you reduce the risk of muscle damage associated, particularly with running up and down mountains, which you get a lot more damage. So I think it's a really good point to make, and it doesn't necessarily mean taking on more is going to make you more efficient and going to make you faster. I think we've also got to remember that it's not just nutrition that's changed. The shoes have also changed. There's a lot that's changed that has made these times get a lot faster. But we do know that taking on some carbohydrate, even if it's like a mouth rinse type, kind of carbohydrate, we know that does trick the central nervous system into thinking there's energy available, and it can help you to kind of maintain your pace for that little bit longer. So we often see the elites do that, because particularly at the end, when they don't want to waste time necessarily swallowing, they just take a swig and they spit it out, but they still get that kind of extended ability to run. But what I will say is I think what often gets forgotten is that when you do run, and particularly when you run hard, you are putting a lot of pressure on your mechanical system and your cardiovascular system. So in turn, you're putting quite a lot of pressure on your central nervous system. And I guess if you want to do that more regularly, then taking on the carbohydrate during, and particularly also in recovery, just helps you to not get too burnt out fundamentally. So I think I completely hear what you're saying, and I do question sometimes whether we do need to be consuming quite so much. And at the end of the day, the sports nutrition market is huge. So we can't move away from it.
It has been proven to work. There's no sort of fundamental ignoring the fact that people are doing all this sort of stuff.
It's an interesting point about the market. We did sort of briefly discuss it off mic. We're like, do we have to be careful about where some of these studies are from? Because I guess if you're like a sports drink manufacturer or a gel manufacturer, then it's great news, isn't it? 90 grams, 120 grams, that's great news. That's like 50% more, more people buying, or people buying 50% more than they might have previously. We'd be wise, wouldn't we, to think about where these studies are coming from if they're being funded by companies with a kind of vested interest.
Absolutely. I think, we know that there are many, many industries out there. Sports industry is one. You look at the wellness industry, the diet industry, and everybody is fundamentally trying to profit from those that are vulnerable. Yeah. And we have to be careful about that, definitely. And I'm in a very fortunate position that as a sports dietitian, I get sent a lot of products. I get to sample a lot of products, but I'm always very mindful of how much I promote them or share them, because I'm very conscious that a lot of it's expensive and not everybody has the financial ability to consume or to purchase that much, in terms of product. So I do think there are other, there's nothing wrong with jelly babies.
Yeah.
They worked for me back in 2012. Yeah. I reckon they could still work for
There's
a
lot
lot
of grams
people.
of carb in a jelly baby, aren't they? They're quite good, aren't they?
Yeah. There's like 6 grams per jelly baby.
Yeah.
Pretty good.
I was going to ask you about real food alternatives. So jelly babies is one, isn't it?
I mean, because we've just focused very much on sport-specific stuff, but you're a big experimenter on the run of like things that you can eat that are full of sugar.
Yeah, I've tried it. I think I've definitely gone and I've made my own gels and stuff. We've actually making my own gels was quite relatively successful compared to some of the other experiments.
Yes. Right.
But what should be jelly babies is a good one. I guess bananas is really good, isn't it? So they're quite heavy, aren't they? Quite big.
Mm.
But I mean, I guess not necessarily food groups, perhaps, but just experimenting, right? Like this is runners should be not just immediately. I don't know, as you say, like 40 grams maybe when someone's starting out with this sort of stuff. Like, try something. Don't go for a gel
Have
straight
some
away.
dates.
Well, not 40 grams of dates. That sounds quite a lot. But I just think that there's room for people to understand a bit of self experimenting.
Yeah, different ways of getting there.
Get it wrong a bit and then get it right a bit.
Yeah.
100%. And I think also just be mindful that you might think you've got it sussed, and then you go and do a race and it doesn't work for you. That's a classic, right? So, I mean, I've obviously moved away from road running, and I generally do sort of the mountain fell trail running. So it's a bit of a different beast. And I do tend to generally rely on real food, but I'll always take a carb drink because it's an easy way to get energy. And particularly when you're using poles, for example, it's quite a good way to, hands-free, because you're using your poles and stuff. So, but I do, I think the time I would rely on sports nutrition is when I'm trying to go fast.
Yeah.
Like if I've got a particular kind of goal, if I've got I did do a 10K race at the start of the year. It was trail, but it was, in the grand scheme of things, it was fast. There's no way I'd be using real food on that because I'm just going hard, So I think you do have to be a little bit more conscious of that. And even when I was trying to eat jelly babies on a marathon, it was quite entertaining, I think, for the people around me. So, and again, practice. If you can get good at chewing. So I had a friend the other day, and she was saying she just puts it in her mouth and just lets it dissolve. And I'm like, okay, well, if that works for you, that works for you. So I think absolutely you're both kind of right in it's so important to practice and find something that works for you. Don't get too hung up on the numbers. I kind of go, I think if you can get the 60 grams in per hour, you're going to do yourself a favor. Yeah. I is kind of where I'm always at. If I can get that in, I'm comfortable. If I end up having some hours where I have a bit more, great. But generally speaking, I'll kind of aim for that 60 as a good point to be comfortable.
That's great, really. Thank you very, very much for coming on and talking about carbs. What's coming up for you in your running? Have you got anything planned this year? So
I actually did a marathon the same day as London Marathon, but I did a fell marathon. Wow. So it was like 1,400 meters of elevation. So it was not a fast one, but it was fast for me. And I've got Lakeland 50 coming up in 10 weeks.
Oh, great. Well, best of luck with all that.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thanks again. It's always great to chat to you about this. I feel like you're a voice of wisdom in what is quite a confusing area.
Yeah, and we look forward to the next column.
Absolutely.
Yes, it'll be done today.
All right, good.
Excellent.
Okay,
Great.
we'll tell the boss. All right.
Thanks, not really. Thank you.
Right, I'll just pause
Take
all
care.
this.
If you haven't heard already, Runners World has got a club.
That's right. 30 years in the making, the Runners World Club is here to take your running even further.
And as our dedicated viewers, listeners and fans, let's say fans, we wanted to tell you more about it. So we've got a guest here to talk about it.
That's right. We're here with our friend and colleague Jen Bazon, Membership Director, to learn more. So Jen, tell us, what exactly is the Runners World Club?
So Runners World Club is our best ever brand experience and gives readers access to a multitude of benefits, experiences and rewards in addition to receiving the print magazine every month. And a membership to Runners World Club really does give you everything you could possibly need to get fitter, faster and healthier.
You could do with a bit of that.
Me? Yeah. Does sound good, actually, yeah.
Yeah. What do people get, Jen? What is included in a membership?
So we've got 3 different tiers of membership: bronze, silver and gold. And our gold membership is our sort of top tier, all singing, all dancing membership. And with that, you get access to our brand new training plan library via our reimagined companion app. You get access to award-winning training platform Final Surge, which gives you the ability to sync Runners World plans with your training devices. So with your Garmin, Apple Watch, Sunto, Polo, whatever your kind of preference. And that means that you can follow training sessions in real time on your watch with guided prompts. So it saves you having to sort of memorise interval sessions and things like that, as it's all programmed into your watch. You also receive our monthly print magazine, our weekly Runners World Club newsletter, and you get full access to the reimagined companion app, where you can access discounts and deals from running and fitness brands, and you also get access to exclusive gold member only content. So it's jam-packed with benefits.
And there are these live events, aren't there? Spencer Matthews was seen on last weekend with Runners World, and Susie Chan. So tell us about those.
Yes, very exciting. So what we wanted to do with membership was give our members the chance to meet and get to know each other, as well as the Runners World team and celebrity guests as well. So yeah, we hosted our first event the day before the London Marathon with Spencer Matthews, Susie Chan at the Samsung store in King's Cross, and it was a lot of fun. We had 85 runners there, and we did a shakeout run and Q&A, and it was very exciting, and the feedback was brilliant. So we're already excitedly planning our next one.
Excellent.
Let's get into the guts of this. Training plans.
Yes.
It's going to be the main draw. Lots of people have probably used the Runners World training plan across their many years of running. What are the training plans looking like?
Yeah, so our training plans have been written by Tom Craggs, Robbie Britton and Georgia Wood, and we've produced this brand new library which you can get via the app, and they span from 5k to ultramarathon. And what's really brilliant is runners now have the ability to customise those plans according to their training preferences. So if you want to, say you've got a marathon coming up in 20 weeks' time and you're targeting 3 hours, 45 minutes, and you want to do 3 to 4 runs per week, you just put that into the filter and you'll be served a tailored plan. And in addition to that, every 4 weeks in those plans, there's the opportunity to kind of reflect on how your training's going and choose an alternative plan if it's not quite working out. So say that kind of 3:45 time goal was a little bit punchy, you can sort of change to 4 hours. So that self-reflection kind of ensures you sort of are following the plan that is actually right for you.
Right, I want in. How do I join?
So you can join by clicking the link in the episode description or searching Runners World Club and signing up via the Hearst Magazine's website. And it's priced at $9.99 for your first 3 months, which is an absolute bargain.
A steal.
That is an absolute deal.